This morning I mentioned a name that is the most commonly used in Israel today for Jesus. It's a mispronunciation of his name. Most Israelis don't even know the difference. They just speak of him as Yeshu. And the rabbis have, over the last few centuries, pulled off a coup in that regard, because his name is actually Yeshua. Yeshu is an acrostic which stands for the words, "May his name be forgotten." And most Israelis, when they hear that for the first time, just don't believe you. Well, that's just a Christian explanation until you open up the dictionary and show it to them. And this is important because of where this word comes from. You remember when the angel announced to Mary, "You shall call his name Jesus," Yeshua, because he will save, Yeshua, his people. So the little banner there along the side of the road is something that the Jews for Jesus have done in their campaigns in Israel with some frequency now. They'll buy the side of a bus for some advertising, or they'll put up these banners in different places with a number to call. And if you're mad about it, you can call. If you're curious about it, you can call and find out more. And the banner says Yeshu is Yeshua, and that comes from Yeshua. And it's a very significant, helpful way to testify, to witness in Israel. Now, this is our third and final sermon on this very, very important passage of Scripture. We're into chapter 53, and in a minute I want to read all of the text one more time. But just as by way of reminder, there are 5 stanzas of 3 verses each. It's very symmetrical, very organized, and I've used different kinds of titles. Tonight it would be My Servant Will Save, because we see the success, the victory of the suffering and what it brought about in terms of our salvation. But here's another way of looking at it, the enigma of the servant. Remember in 52, the last couple verses, people are astonished. They're amazed. They didn't realize. Then the exclusion of the servant, we looked at that this morning in the first 3 verses of chapter 3, and how the Jewish people despised and rejected him. But then it got into the efficacy of the Savior, and actually this is one of the most concentrated places in all of Scripture to study and to look at the idea of a vicarious atonement in the place of others. And we'll take at least a brief walkthrough or look at that in a few minutes here, but it is repeated over and over and over, some 8 or 9 times in these few verses, that he died on behalf of, in the place of others. Tonight we're going to begin verses 7 through 9 with the execution of the servant, and then close with the final and very glorious stanza, the exaltation of the servant. This is one of the so-called servant songs. There are 4, or depending on how you do the counting, maybe 5. Some people include chapter 55 as a 5th servant song, but it doesn't speak there about my servant. In fact, here in chapter 53, it's the last time that servant appears in the singular in the book of Isaiah. He goes back to speaking to and about his servants, plural. But that's one of the big questions here. Of whom does the prophet speak? And we've concluded, and it's primarily on the basis of New Testament interpretation of these passages, that this can't be Israel. This can't be even the prophet Isaiah. This must be the servant of the Lord, the righteous one, as he's called in this passage. And that's kind of a unique turn. You find it in the New Testament, but here it is the Messiah who becomes righteousness for others. That sounds like straight out of Romans. And it is, but it's here in Isaiah. And the idea then of the Lord's servant being the Messiah, and he's more than just a servant, more than just a man. He is, in fact, God himself. So, before we begin, let's just start with reading here of the text. I'm in chapter 52, the last 3 verses and then through 53. 52:13. Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as many were astonished at you, my people, so his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Thus he will sprinkle or startle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths on account of him. For what they had not been told, they will see, and what they had not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of parched ground. He had no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due? His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. So this may be a servant song, but this is very much a song for transgressors all the way through, and we certainly pick that up here at the end. Let's look at verses 7 through 9 and the execution, or properly said, the murder of the Son of God. Verse 7 speaks of how he suffered in silence. Now remember, this is prophecy. This is 700 years before it happened. And that's the more remarkable because crucifixion didn't even exist yet. The Assyrians would impale a person on a stake, but it was not nailing him to a cross shape or anything of that sort. That was a purely Roman invention. Started fairly early in the Roman Empire and was at its peak in the first century. In fact, if you read Josephus and some of the other historians from the time period, thousands of people were executed by crucifixion. One day in Jerusalem alone, 6,000 were crucified. Now, keep that in mind, because in a few moments I want to say something about where is all the evidence for this. We've got literary evidence, we've got written testimony, but in all of archaeology, we have one example so far. Go figure. So let's take a look here at this. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. His treatment was absolutely unjust. He was oppressed and afflicted. It was a complete miscarriage of justice. One of the looser translations says he was harassed and belabored. Harassed as if by a cruel taskmaster. Belabored as in mistreated and pushed around. And yet his response was completely submissive. He knew this was the Father's will for him. And last week I pointed that out. If you can just imagine him growing up as a boy and reading the prophet Isaiah or hearing the local rabbi in his synagogue speak about the suffering of the Messiah and meditating on verses like these, knowing it spoke about him. That this was the Father's will for him to suffer. Yet it says, like a lamb that is led to slaughter and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers. And I mentioned this morning that sheep are pretty, I used the word stupid. Somebody took me to task and say, well, maybe foolish. But I think I'm going to go back to what I said before. They're just plain stupid. I mean, they do the silliest things. They don't do what you've tried to train them or show them how to do. They have to be led. You can't drive sheep or say, go do something. They will almost in every instance pick the wrong way. And that's why it was used as in our text here as all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way. But here the sheep is used, and this is certainly legitimate too. I mean, what is cuter than a little lamb? What is more beautiful than a mama ewe taking care of her little baby lamb out in the pasture? It's a beautiful picture. And the picture here, of course, is slightly different, but again, it is a very true, very realistic picture. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter and like a sheep that is silent before his shearers, he did not open his mouth. Now, that phrase is repeated twice here in this verse. And by the way, it is very much emphasized in the gospel accounts about Jesus. And I've given you some text there to show you that. But I want to just show you a couple pictures here before I get into those texts as well. Sheep shearing is quite a process. Now, the pictures I found here are actually very well done. When I tried it once upon a time, I spent 3 days once working with some sheep just so I could learn something about this and know what I was talking about. And that's how I came to the conclusion that they're more than just foolish. But I also got to help with one sheep shearing. We had to do the dipping, and that was ugly and smelly. But then I got to do one of the shearings, and I'm telling you, it's a whole lot harder than it looks when these guys do it. I mean, they take that thing off, and it's all one nice big old piece and heavy. I had about 6 or 7 particles and, a lot of scraps left on the sheep and a whole bunch of little red dots all over it. And you know what? He didn't say anything. That was exactly the point here. He was dumb, didn't speak in front of his shearers. These guys are good. I mean, take a look at the end result. You see just a beautiful white skin without the wool on it. And I don't see any red dots there from these shearers. They knew what they were doing. But it is the unique thing. A sheep will just stand there very patiently and very silent while you take the wool off. And that's the picture of the Lord here. Look at some of these verses. I've given you the references so you can look them up more, but I just chose some that especially, first of all, I wanted the different Gospels, but I also wanted you to see the different people that were involved. In Matthew 27, when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, and notice both are plural. In a minute we'll see one about the chief priest. But these are the chief priests and elders. It says, he gave no answer. And then Pilate asked him, don't you hear the testimony they're bringing against you? But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. In Mark chapter 14, and some more in 15. In 14 it says, then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." And of course, the high priest turned that into obvious, instant blasphemy, so of course he's guilty. In chapter 15 of Mark, verses 4 and 5, again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Luke tells the story of Herod, who saw Jesus, and he was greatly pleased because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. And John adds, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" And Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. And 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23 summarizes this, saying, while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. I'll tell you, that's one of the hardest things of my Christianity, not speaking back. It doesn't fit my wiring. It's not in my nature. I want to put my dukes up right away. And I want to spit and fight. And the Lord's example is so opposite. He suffered in silence, in verse 8, yet he was slaughtered for sinners. Verse says, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. The arbitration was completely illegal, and probably when we get into the Gospel of Mark soon, in the next few months, I'll have a chance to review some of that toward the end of that Gospel. But back when we were looking at Matthew and Luke, I do remember going into a lot of detail about the illegality of the trials of Jesus. There were 3 Jewish trials or encounters, and there were 3 Roman encounters. And every one of them was just absolutely illegal by their own standards, by their own rules. You know, it was in the middle of the night. It was without having anybody there. It was without having 2 or 3 witnesses. The witnesses they did have contradicted each other. Everything about this judgment was just wrong, illegal. It was rushed, and it was completely illegal. There are 6 stages in the trials, and are all characterized by rushed timing, fabricated and conflicting witnesses, no jury, no presumption of innocence. So the phrase here, taken away, the Hebrew word has kind of the idea of being snatched out, something that's hurried, something that's forcible, and something that necessarily has to be violent in order for it to happen. Now look at this next phrase, because it is of some interest and not an easy one to understand or translate. As for his generation, who considered? Now, I want to just take that part first. The word for generation here is a real common word. It's the word dor, D-O-R, and very frequently you'll have from generation to generation, midor ledor, and it's repeated like that. And in that sense, it usually means your descendants, the next generation, or the generation that you're part of. And that's why it's a little bit complicated here. If you have an NIV, it translated it, his descendants. But I don't think that that's accurate at this point. I think the point that's being made is, in his day, his generation of people, who gave it any thought? They just completely ignored it. They despised him. So who in his generation had any consideration for him or what was happening there? So who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people? The purpose was vicarious, and that was determined by God himself, God the Father. And we're going to be seeing that now repeatedly. But that word cut off is a violent word. It's used, for instance, in the idea of chopping down a tree. He was chopped off. He was cut off. Motyer says it's a verb with an almost unbroken record of violence, the way that it's used often in Scripture. Notice it's for the transgression of my people. I think that's the prophet speaking there who is giving this prophecy. He's speaking of my people, Israel. It could be God speaking, but I think this is the prophet that is now beginning to realize from the revelation that he's receiving that this was done for the people of Israel. Actually, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, we're told that he, God, made him, Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And that's this idea of vicarious sacrifice for sin. It's expressed all the way through this passage. It's back in verse 5, verse 6, verse 8, verse 10, verse 11, and verse 12. Leading Alan McRae to say there are few, if any, passages in the Bible where a single idea is repeated so many times. It is definitely one of the key thoughts of this whole text. Vicarious sacrifice. He suffered in the place of others. He had no sin. He did not deserve this, but he took our sin upon himself. And that's the meaning of that last little phrase right there, to whom the stroke was due. This is not to be forgotten by the Jewish people and not to be forgotten by you and I. This is something that we must remember with pain. It was our punishment, our just due for our sin. And that led him, in verse 9, to be subjected to great shame. This verse ends with a because. Why did this happen? But it begins by saying, his grave was assigned with wicked men. And again, there's some difficulties in the understanding, the translation of it. The idea isn't so complicated, especially given the revelation of the New Testament. But if you were just reading this for the first time, the word given there is actually the idea of being assigned, as the NASV has translated, and better than what the King James Bible had. And the King James translation influenced the whole several generations of translations. It says he made his grave with the wicked. Well, he ended up, of course, on the cross between two thieves with the wicked, but he was assigned that. He was given. The Hebrew word is actually a very simple one. The word to give. 10, if those of you that have studied it. Now, it's natural to conclude that if he was crucified with criminals, that he would have been buried with them. That was a very common Roman practice throughout this time. And that may be the answer to why it is that we don't have more evidence of crucifixion. Because the common practice was to just take the bodies after they were good and dead and dump them in a hole. And maybe burn them because of the stench and everything, but they were just left to rot. They weren't given a decent burial. There is one instance, a guy, and we actually know his name, Jonathan. They happened by chance, as they were putting a road in on top of the Mount of Olives, to break into the roof of this tomb that was under the ground. They didn't know it was there. And they found an ossuary, a bone box, and it had his name on it, and inside it had the ankle bones fused together with a nail through them. And evidence of rub marks, apparently from nails, in his wrist. And remember, by the way, yad, or hand in Hebrew, can be your whole arm. And so that may well be. It's the only archaeological evidence that we have of crucifixion, one out of literally thousands. And the reason for that is his family apparently were very wealthy. I mean, they had a carved tomb on the Mount of Olives, and they apparently recovered his body and, in shame, gave it a decent burial. Now, perhaps other people did that too, but not very many. It's not very likely, because they could bring more judgment upon themselves. If it was your son who was crucified as a criminal, you probably wanted to kind of distance yourself from that situation. And the Romans would help you in staying away. So this whole idea of being assigned a place with the wicked men, and yet it goes on to say he was with a rich man in his death. The plans of men were foiled in this. It was intended to be a shameful death and burial, and yet he ends up with a rich man in his death. And again, some interesting little grammatical things going on here. For instance, the word death is plural. What's that all about? Jesus didn't have to die multiple times. But the word death being plural, there's two possibilities. It could be to correspond to the idea of life. The Hebrew word for life is chaim, which is a plural word. So lives and deaths, that could be it. I think, though, the better explanation is probably the same one that we use for plural term or name for God, Elohim. You hear that I am on the end of it, and we call that the plural of majesty. Now, you can find the Trinity embedded in that term. I think you need to go to other arguments and other texts to be able to establish that, but it's certainly possible with the word Elohim. And that idea of the plurality of majesty or intensity, I think, is what's going on here. His death was as if it were a million deaths, because he bore the sins of all of mankind and suffered horribly. I want to talk about that suffering before we're done, but he was subjected to great shame. And in that, the plan of God was fulfilled. Again, remember, this was written 700 years before his crucifixion. That word, yet he was with a rich man in his death, it's the simple word and so a lot of our English Bibles will have just an and in there. But that is a conjunction. It can be understood as a conversive or a adversive kind of junction. So that's too much to say. It can be but in some cases, which I think is it here. But or yet is a legitimate way of understanding it, and you do that on the basis of the context. There's a big contrast being made right here. Being crucified, put to death with wicked men, yet he, by prophecy here, ends up in the grave of a rich man. How does that happen? Well, again, remembering that this is 700 years before it happened, it seems like such a almost silly little grammatical detail in there, and yet that shows you the pointedness of this prophecy. Literally, it says, with a rich man in his death. There's no definite article there. I think the King James says he was with the rich in his death, but no definite article there. So let me read for you the fulfillment of this in Matthew 27. Verses 57 through 60. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and then Pilate ordered it be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. And everything about it and everything about the archaeology of this indicates wealth. A new tomb in which never man had laid. That's an important archaeological detail in trying to understand where is the empty tomb in Jerusalem. Interestingly, remember Nicodemus was involved with this, and according to the Talmud, Jewish records themselves, doesn't say anything about Nicodemus being a disciple of Jesus, but it does say he was the richest man in Jerusalem at the time. So he was with the rich men in his death. The two Martin brothers wrote a commentary on this, and they say, with what seemingly irrelevant details prophecy is sometimes concerned. Yet that which appears to be irrelevant furnishes proof of the genuineness of this prophecy. There could be no accidental fulfillment of such a prediction as this. He who was crucified between two evildoers was buried in the tomb of a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea. Now, I ran across another interesting thing in my studies this week. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're probably familiar that in cave number 4, there was a copy. Actually, there were 2 copies, complete copies of the scroll of Isaiah. And at this particular verse, the word for man here is plural, but the original copyist erased the plural ending and made it a singular. Now, why might he have done that, or why might he have corrected it? The normal explanation is this is a form of ditography, because he was crucified with wicked men, plural, yet he was with a rich, not men, but a rich man in his death. And the scribe apparently caught his own mistake. He just did plural, plural, and then he realized, wait a minute, that's not right. And he rubbed it out, which you can do as long as you don't damage the scroll and you can copy over it. But you can see the evidence on the Isaiah scroll at this verse. Notice the next phrase, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. Even his enemies acknowledged this. The Herodians said, and this is recorded in Matthew 22, verse 16, Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth, and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. That's pretty high praise. Now, they didn't believe in him. They tried to trip him up, but they had to acknowledge there was no deceit in him. A man in whom was no guile, similar to what he said about Nathaniel. Nathaniel? Thanks. The word for violence here is also somewhat interesting, and this wasn't necessarily a plan. In fact, we're dealing with different languages, but guess what the Hebrew word is for violence? You've heard it before. Hamas. Now, in Arabic, that has a different meaning today, but that does seem to be fitting. Now, that's the execution of the servant, and thankfully, the story does not end there. Let's go to verses 10 through 12, and the exaltation of this servant. It begins with great success after this horrible sacrifice in verse 10. But the Lord, Yahweh, Jehovah, which equally applies to Jesus as the second person of the Trinity, but in this case it's drawing a distinction between this servant and the one who is speaking and the one who plans this. The Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. The reason for all of this was God's will. The word pleased there is somewhat complicated. Depending on the context, that is certainly appropriate. There are numerous places where the word appears, and that fits well. But here, it's not so much pleasure as purpose. It was his purpose. It was his will. He was pleased to do it. And by the way, before we're done, take a look how that is repeated at the end of this verse. It's an inclusio here in verse 10. So this really is about God's purpose, his plan, that which pleases him. It may come from Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is the other really significant piece of Scripture that deals in great specifics with the crucifixion. If you've got your finger there, look at verse 8, because there this same word is used. Commit yourself to the Lord, let him deliver him, let him rescue him, because he delights in him. But the portion that begins to deal then specifically with the crucifixion picks up down there in verse 11. Psalm 22, verse 11. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open wide their mouth at me as a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws, and you lay me in the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. I'm not going to take the time to go into some of the details there, but you can quickly recognize many references to the crucifixion scenes in the gospel in that. And I think that perhaps in Isaiah's mind, he would have had David's writings, that he is recalling this psalm. And remember, back in verse 8, it refers to God's delight, his pleasure, his purpose. In this case, though, was for the crushing of his son. And that word crush is another very strong word here. It means to be broken, shattered, smashed to pieces. It comes from a very strong word, and it's followed by the word grief here, which is also strong. It means to be rubbed or worn or made weak. Culver says Calvary was no accident, no improvisation in the nick of time. All of this was written down 700 years before it happened. In fact, Peter, on the day of Pentecost, recorded for us in Acts 2:23, Peter said, "This man was delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God." There's no escaping that thought. There's no way to explain it off. This was God's purpose. In that sense, it was God's pleasure that this should happen to his son. That just shows us all the more the weight of our guilt, our iniquities, our transgressions that put him there. So here is an interesting phrase. The if doesn't cast any doubt or question. You could almost say since. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring. Now, several complications. First of all, if you're reading from the NASV, notice that the pronoun his offspring is added. I think it's accurate, and I think it's primarily because of what follows here. But this is one of those problems I've mentioned a couple times previously of the changing pronouns or the lack of pronouns or the use of the pronouns throughout this whole text. It's very complicated. In English, you stick something in there and that solves all the problems. You don't have to worry about it anymore. But every time I go back to this, I grapple with it and I try to think, now, of whom does the prophet speak? What's going on here? Who is this about? Who's doing what? Who's on first? And here is a case in point, so let's look at it. By the way, this, I think, is the joyful answer to the rhetorical question back in verse 8. As for his generation, who considered? Who gave this any thought? Who saw what this would possibly mean? Well, he rendered himself, he saw, he understood, and the result is he's going to see his offspring. The word for offspring there is seed, which very definitely means his descendants. But here's the interesting twist, and I mentioned this morning. A disciple can be called a son. That's not an uncommon way of speaking. But descendants are called seed, and others wouldn't be. A disciple is not the seed of his teacher. And yet here we are, those who believe and receive are known as his seed, his offspring. And I think the only way you can understand or explain that is through regeneration, new birth. We become the children of God. not by our decision, not by a husband's choice, but by God's determinate decision, counsel. Notice here this mention also of a guilt offering. In Psalm 22, you probably have already closed that, but a little bit lower in the chapter, verses 31 and 32, it says, "Posterity will serve him. It will be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They will come and will declare his righteousness to a people who will be born, that he has performed it." So I think the same idea is embedded back there in Psalm 22 also with regard to the crucifixion. Look at this guilt offering. The Hebrew word is asham, and it's used both for the sacrifice itself, guilt offering, but it's also the word that is used for the sin part of it, the guilt part of it. The same word, and you have to look at the context in order to grasp that. Obviously, he's not the sin. He's not the guilt. He's an offering for the guilt. It's a restitution that is made in the Old Testament Levitical system. It's a restitution that was made for wrongs that were committed. It's the payment of an indemnity for transgression. And interesting then that the same word is used both for the offering and for the guilt itself. Now, it is in this, I think, that God's pleasure is understood. It is this in which he delights. And I take as my reason for that Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 23 and 24. "Let not a wise man boast of his wisdom, and let not the mighty man boast of his might. Let not the rich man boast of his riches, but let him who boasts boast of this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, who exercises loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth. For I delight in these things." And that is indeed what the Son did and does. Everything that brings delight to the Father. And that included bearing the sin of the world. Now, the result is that he's going to see his offspring. And, of course, that's considered one of the most obvious evidences of the Lord's blessing, isn't it? Not always the case, either the lack thereof nor the provision thereof. But we would naturally think, wow, you got a baby. That's fantastic. God must love you. The opposite is not true in our human experience. If you're not able to bear children or haven't been able to bear children, that doesn't mean that God is judging you. But here we can rejoice in this. He will see his offspring. He will see his seed reproduced. Now, who might be the offspring of the Messiah, if not us? And then the phrase goes on to say, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Notice again, if you're using NASV, the pronoun his is supplied here. But again, I think it's appropriate. He, this Messiah, is going to prolong his days. In other words, his activities didn't end with his death. This is actually, I think, a reference to his resurrection and his ongoing life. Prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. The results are the success of God's plan. This is where the word pleasure appears again, forming that inclusio with the beginning of this same verse. What are the elements of this blessing? He'll see his offspring, he will prolong his days, and the will of the Lord is going to prosper as a result. This idea of prolonging his days is also picked up repeatedly in the New Testament. In Hebrews chapter 7, verse 16, it says, he has the power of an indestructible life. That's a deep thought worth some meditation. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 23, because of him we are born of imperishable seed. So because of him, we enjoy that same quality, that same characteristic. In Revelation 1, that grand scene when John sees his friend, whom he hasn't seen now for some 60 years, And Jesus speaks to him, and I won't do it and scare you again, but remember, John's there meditating, praying. It's nice and quiet on the island of Patmos, and a loud voice like a trumpet. I could do that if I tried right here. I mean, can't you imagine being startled? You're helping me back there. Can't you imagine being startled by that? And what does John do? He falls down on his face before him. That's what you see every time in Scripture when somebody comes face to face with the Lord. Even with just an angel. It's fear and trembling, and they have to say, don't be afraid. Get up. And here's John's best friend. He says, John, it's me. And here's what he says specifically in verses 17 and 18. I am the first and the last and the living one. I was dead, and behold, look at me. I am alive forevermore. Oh, man, what a message to receive. His activities did not end with his death. And by the way, that comes back into play in the book of Revelation, chapter 5, verses 6 and down in 12 and 14. I saw between the throne, John speaking again, with the four living creatures and the elders, a lamb standing, as if slain. And they were saying with a loud voice, worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. And every created thing which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and on the sea and all things in them. I heard saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and dominion forever and ever. And the four living creatures kept saying, Amen. So be it. And the elders fell down and worshipped. He is alive forevermore. Now that leads to verse 11, the great satisfaction that comes as a result of this suffering. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. I'm not sure what the it is. I think it may be his seed. It's a singular form there, but it involves many descendants. I think that's what's going to be his satisfaction here. But look at this anguish. The word means trouble or labor, a very wearing kind of an effort. Just look at all the related words throughout this text. Stricken, smitten, afflicted, pierced, crushed, punishment, wounds. Now, he suffered in his body. That was terrible, but probably the least significant here, really. That's what we look at, whether it's in pictures of crucifixion or movies about it. We tend to emphasize that, and it was horrid in every way. But that was not the most important suffering here. I'd say at least equal, if not more suffering in his regard, would be the suffering of his soul, the suffering of his spirit here. There was suffering of his heart. He was despised and rejected of men. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But the harshest thing that he had to endure for us was the Father turning his face away. And I don't think we can even begin to understand that. We can put words to it, but I don't think we can fully understand that. I had a great dad, and I honored him and wanted so much his affection and his approval, and he was usually generous in giving it. But I can tell you a time or two where he didn't because I did something wrong. And boy, to see the Father dark and not open to you, that is horrible. And that's on the simple human level as a kid. Imagine his being turned away. The Father turned his face away. In John chapter 12, verse 27, Jesus praying in the garden says, Now my soul has become troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Matthew 26, verse 38, My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Hebrews 12, verse 2, it says, For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame. The cause of his satisfaction was seeing the fruit of his labor. And so our verse goes on to say, by his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many. If you don't have anything else, there's proof enough right there that this is not about the people of Israel. This is not about Isaiah. This can only be about the Holy Son of God, the righteous one, whose sacrifice is sufficient to pay the penalty of the sin of the world, all of which was laid on him. The outcome is the salvation of many. And there's an interesting phrase, which I'm not going to get into very deeply right now, but the many here implies that it's not all. It's pretty clear. Now, I struggled with that fifth point, or the fourth point, however you count it. I struggled with that for a very long time. But it's certainly embedded in a phrase like that. He died for the many. He will justify the many. He will justify is tied to the satisfaction of the previous verse. He will be satisfied by his knowledge. And we've got, again, some good texts. We looked at some of those when we were studying through Romans chapter 4, verse 25. He who was delivered over because of our transgressions and was raised because of our justification. Romans 5:19. For as through the one man's disobedience, speaking of Adam, the many were made sinners, even so through the obedience of the one, the many will be made righteous. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. And so this verse concludes with, as he will bear their iniquities. My servant, righteous himself, secures righteousness for many, and makes their iniquities his own load. Finally, verse 12, the settlement after service, the compensation or the reward that's here. Therefore, God the Father speaking again, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong. Who exactly are the great? I can't determine. Back in chapter 12, it mentions these great ones that see and understand. It could be with them, but that doesn't seem to fit the historical theological context here. The word for great just means the many or much. And I think that may fit better with this idea of his offspring. He is going to participate. He's going to be present in his own millennial kingdom with us there as his subjects. And that is going to be his great portion, his joy, dividing the spoils, the booty, with the strong. And by the way, notice he will divide. It's an active tense. He's going to be the one doing the dividing with them and for them and to them. Notice it's because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. His reward will be his exaltation here. Yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. The consequence of everything here is the glory of God. He bore the sin of many. Remember when he instituted what we know as the Lord's Supper? He said, "This is the blood of the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." He made intercession for the transgressors. He doesn't just give up, but he ever lives to intercede for them. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25. So today, right now, tonight, you have a Jewish man, the God-man, seated at the right hand of the Father, praying for you, interceding for you, your advocate, your defender. And so when the devil appears to accuse you, Jesus can justly say, you don't have to pay any attention to that. I covered that. That's been taken care of. Amen. Look at a concluding summary of this whole segment here. Verse 1 through 3, his life was sinless. It was announced beforehand. It was anticipated, but very wrongly understood at first. And so his death was sacrificial, verses 4 through 6. It was voluntary and had great, great value for us and for all of mankind. And his atonement, his salvation, the redemption that he wrought, was substitutionary. It was a violent death, but he was victorious in doing that. Verses 10 through 12, his resurrection was prophesied. He would prolong his days. He would come back. Death did not end it. And I think we can add here a fifth point. His return is as certain as his life and death was. And so I conclude with this question. Are you ready? Are you ready for that? Let me just read in closing 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 and following. Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. Here's the quote, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously, and he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed, for you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. This is a shepherd song, but it is very much also a song for transgressors. And I'd like to conclude tonight by singing a hymn together. It's number 301 in our hymn book. You can find a copy there in front of you.